So the central nervous system is organized spatially. We won't spend too much time on this. I just wanted to add this graphic because I feel like I've seen it a lot, especially when I'm studying throughout like undergrad and even in high school. This graphic, known as a homunculus, demonstrates the fact that the cerebral cortex has specific regions that control specific functions. So that means exactly what I wrote in the title. Just keep in mind that the central nervous system is organized spatially. So there are specialized areas in the brain and specialized area in the spinal cord that handle specific neurological functioning and specific nervous functioning. So the central nervous system integrates information from the entire body to coordinate activity, like we said. And remember that the central nervous system is, again, made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so afferent neurons may synapse with interneurons in the central nervous system before relaying information back to the efferent neurons. So as we mentioned before, afferent means that they are arriving to the central nervous system, and efferent means that they are exiting from the central nervous system. So sometimes they synapse with each other, and sometimes they synapse with interneurons, which are just smaller neurons that can sort of alter the message. So like, for example, we sometimes talk about them in reflex arcs, where they'll sort of change an excitatory impulse to an inhibitory impulse. But that's really all I want to go in depth with in terms of interneurons right now, because I think it's just more important that we understand the role of afferent and efferent neurons. Okay, yeah, I mean, so when you have some free time, if you want to just stare at this diagram, sometimes it's trippy, but it's kind of interesting, and it's pretty useful. Okay, so moving on to the peripheral nervous system. We have sensory neurons that receive information and relay it through the dorsal root ganglion before relaying it to the central nervous system. These are known as afferent neurons. So like we said before a couple of times in this lecture, sensory neurons are afferent neurons. Afferent neurons are arriving neurons. So they are coming from your body to the central nervous system. And I used the phrase dorsal root ganglion. I said post-pre-ganglionic cells before. So ganglia, which is a plural of ganglion, are clusters of cell bodies. And on that note, nerves are bundles of axons traveling in the same direction. So for example, we talked about the sciatic nerve a little bit before and how it's just one single axon. The length of it is one single axon, but the actual nerve is a bundle of different neurons. So a nerve is a bundle of axons, and the ganglia are clusters of cell bodies. So these sensory neurons, these afferent neurons, have their ganglia close to the central nervous system, and we refer to that as the dorsal root ganglion. So the information goes there, and then that is where they synapse with the efferent neurons. So motor neurons carry information away from the central nervous system to target tissue. These are also known as efferent neurons. So just know that the dorsal root ganglia, they're located just outside of the spinal cord, and it's where the two different types, the afferent and efferent neurons, communicate with each other. So that's where they access the central nervous system, they're processed, and then they go back out. Okay, a little bit more on the autonomic nervous system. Efferent nerve pathways in the autonomic system and the autonomic nervous system consist of a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron. It's pretty synonymous with presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron. It's just specifically talking about the ganglion. So sometimes neurons can synapse outside of a ganglion, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same thing here. Preganglionic neuron cell body is in the central nervous system. It synapses with the postganglionic neuron outside of the spinal column. So it's considered part of the central nervous system, but the actual synapse is just outside of the spinal column. So if you're familiar with like the planes of the body and the words we use to identify, like dorsal and ventral, for example. Ventral, I believe, is stomach, like the front of the body, and dorsal is towards the back of the body. So that's where the name dorsal root ganglion comes from. It's dorsal to the spinal column. So that's where that name comes from, and that's where those neurons synapse. The postganglionic axon innervates the target tissue The target tissue is also known as an effector, EFFECTOR. And that gives the expected response after the postganglionic neuron gets the action potential over to the effector. So the relative sizes of post and preganglionic neuron axons differ between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. It might seem insignificant, but it's not a lot to memorize. I would definitely memorize these two bullet points just because I have seen them on the MCAT before. It's not like a huge deal to memorize them, so I think it's definitely worth your while. So the parasympathetic preganglionic axons are long and their postganglionic axons are short. So we're talking about an entire system of 2 axons. The first one, the afferent axon for the parasympathetic nervous system, is longer, and then it's going to synapse closer to the effector. So that's after it synapses, that second axon only has to be shorter. And a way for you to remember that, which I've seen in a couple of different study materials, is para-long pre. So the parasympathetic has a long preganglionic axon. And then opposite, the sympathetic preganglionic axons are shorter because the ganglia are located closer to the central nervous system. So that preganglionic axon, that afferent neuron from the sympathetic nervous system, is going to be a lot shorter. Again, because the ganglia are located closer to the central nervous system, so they're going to synapse, and then that postganglionic axon is going to be much longer because it needs to travel from the central nervous system and it needs to reach the effector, the target tissue. Is that clear? Do you guys understand that? Any questions on that? And I know a lot of this, there's so much terminology that's being thrown around because there's just so much material on the nervous system. So you just have to be very careful and just be very diligent with your independent studies. You can definitely use the slideshow, look back on the Zoom. I recommend, pausing, taking notes, definitely doing that, but use it to guide your independent studies because there may be some topics on here that we don't touch on that are worth your while reviewing.